The 1700s in the Ottoman Empire marked a time of reform, adaptation, and off and on war with European powers, most notably Russia. The empire that had previously been focused heavily on outward expansion was now faced with resolving internal issues and defending its possessions from new expansionist powers. New allies, new enemies, and new challenges faced the Ottoman sultans over the next century. Going to 1700, Mustafa II held the Ottoman throne. To kick off the 18th century, Sultan Mustafa signed the Treaty of Constantinople on July 13, 1700, ending the Russo-Turkish War of 1686 throughout 1700 against Russian Tsar Peter the Great. This treaty gave Azov to Russia, but promised 30 years of peace between the empires. Sultan Mustafa was unable to enjoy the harmony for long though, due to the Edirne event in 1703. The event was a result of angered Janissary Corps, who disapproved of Sultan Mustafa's choice to return to Edirne, not Constantinople, after signing the Treaty of Karlowitz and Constantinople with the Holy League. Mustafa also left most political and administrative power to Feyzullah Efendi, who the Janissaries found to be corrupt and overbearing. When the Ottomans decided to intervene in the civil war in Georgia, a unit of Janissary Corps was supposed to be sent to Georgia to give the empire a military presence. In addition to the Janissaries' existing displeasure, they were also now intended to join this conflict, having not been paid for their proper salaries. Few units began to protest in Constantinople, and were quickly joined by civilians and other soldiers. The protests turned to riots, and after Feyzullah Efendi had the rebels' group of representatives arrested, the rioters turned their sights toward Edirne. But the Janissaries were unsatisfied, and as the Sultan's own soldiers now joined the protesters arriving in Edirne, Mustafa was deposed on August 22, 1703, and Feyzullah Efendi was assassinated. Ahmed III, the brother of Mustafa II, now seized the Ottoman throne, and was faced with the challenge of subduing the rebellious troops. Constantinople remained in a state of unsettled indignation until the appointment of a new Grand Vizier, Ali Pasha. Once Sultan Ahmed could focus more on foreign affairs, he began to improve Ottoman relations with both England and France, as well as forming a new alliance with Charles XII of Sweden. After the Swedish king's loss to Peter the Great of Russia at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman court, and proceeded to convince Sultan Ahmed to declare war on Russia in 1710, despite the 1700 Constantinople Treaty, which should have meant 30 years of peace. The Ottoman Grand Vizier Mehmed Pasha led his troops to a decisive victory, surrounding Peter the Great's men at the Prut River, and forcing the Russians to not only agree to giving up Azov, but they were also required to destroy the fortress of Taganrog and any other Azovian forts, and refrain from interfering in any Polish or Cossack affairs. Once the Russians were no longer a direct adversary for the time being, Ahmed turned his attention to the Venetians, declaring war on Venice in December of 1714. The Ottomans used a coordinated naval and army effort to seize Morea the following year. Word of the Turks' victory made its way to Austria, and the Austrian Emperor Charles VI chose to intervene, kicking off the Austro-Turkish War of 1716 through 1718. Prince Eugene, Austria's Habsburg general, led his troops to drastic success against the Ottomans, although the war itself began to disrupt Dutch and British Mediterranean trade. In 1718, Great Britain and Holland urged the Ottomans, Venetians, and Austrians into signing the Treaty of Passarowitz, ending the conflict and confirming the Ottomans' gain of Morea. Unfortunately for Sultan Ahmed, the agreement also forced him to hand over Belgrade, Little Wallachia, and Banat to Austria, which threw a wrench in his empire's westward expansion. A few years later, in June of 1724, the Russo-Ottoman Treaty was concluded, which was intended to partition their shared neighbor of Safavid Iran. But the Ottomans were essentially chased out of the region by 1730. Potentially fueled by this failure, in addition to anger toward the Sultan's excessive indulgence and overly lavish lifestyle in a time of economic struggle, a Janissary mutiny broke out again, led by Patrona Halil. Sultan Ahmed III was subsequently deposed and replaced on the throne by his nephew, Mahmud I. One of the many sultans to do so, Mahmud was forced to first calm the boiling tensions in his empire after his uncle's overthrow. After roughly a year, Sultan Mahmud was able to end the rebellion with the execution of Halil and a large portion of his supporters. During his reign, Mahmud became stuck in an on-and-off war with Persia, which brought about no real conclusion, whilst also being faced with more discord in Europe beginning in 1735. The new Russo-Turkish War began after Russia decided to sign the Treaty of Ganja with Iran, creating an alliance against the offensive Ottomans. The Russians now turned toward Crimea, which they continuously sieged, burning palaces and fortifications as they pushed deeper into the peninsula. They finally reached Azov, where they captured the Ottomans' fortress there. Although Russian goals were aggressive, all sides of the conflict were essentially subdued by a plague outbreak throughout 1737 to 1739. Still, Austria attempted to join the war against the Turks during 1737, but they faced repeated defeats at the hands of the Ottomans, and eventually lost Belgrade after an incursion in the late summer of 1739. All three empires made negotiation efforts partway through the war, but no progress was made diplomatically. Russia continued to drive deeper into Ottoman territory through 1739, despite the fact that the Austrians seemed to have had enough. The same year, the Treaty of Belgrade was signed, ending the Austro-Turkish War and giving the Ottomans the Kingdom of Serbia, part of Banat, as well as handing over Oltenia over to the Ottoman vassal of Wallachia. Russia was eventually forced to sign the Treaty of Niš, roughly a month later, which ended their war with the Turks while allowing them to keep control of Azov. 6 years after peace was made with his European opponents, Sultan Mahmud died of natural causes, and was succeeded by Osman III. Osman, son of Mustafa II, spent 51 years in captivity after his father's deposition and seemed to have developed some behavioral issues as a consequence. Potentially due to his unusual mind, Osman was not responsible for many significant changes or events in the empire's history. One of the peculiar modifications made during his reign was the banning of all music and musicians from his palace. Nonetheless, a more important action taken by Sultan Osman III was the declaration of the Firman in 1757 that preserved the division of responsibilities for various holy land sites between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. That same year, on October 30th, Osman passed away, leaving the Ottoman throne open to Mustafa III. Mustafa III was determined to create more solidity within the empire. He focused initially on issues with coinage, aqueducts, and other internal affairs, as well as spending a decent amount of time traveling to ensure that his laws were being enforced throughout his territory. Externally, Mustafa was determined to maintain peace with Europe. Despite pressure from Frederick the Great of Prussia to become more involved in European affairs, the Ottomans put great effort into remaining peaceful, until war with Russia became inevitable once again. Russia's overbearing attitude toward Poland and Crimea became too much for the Ottomans, and another Russo-Turkish conflict erupted in 1768. The war was an embarrassing defeat for the Ottoman Empire, which was forced to give up territory, reparations, and allow the Russians to be protectors of Orthodox Christianity in the Ottoman vassal states of Wallachia and Moldavia in 1774. Although a treaty was signed in July, Sultan Mustafa III had actually died of a heart attack in January of 1774, which meant that the war was resolved under the reign of Abdul Hamid I. One of Sultan Abdul Hamid's priorities was to reform the Janissary Corps and all of the Ottoman armed forces, which he did. He is also credited with the establishment of the Imperial Naval Engineering School. Hamid further concentrated significant efforts on strengthening his grip over Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. While Russia was not one of Sultan Hamid's preferred focuses, he eventually was pushed back into war with the recurrent adversary in 1787, after Russia consistently abused their power as Orthodox Christianity's protector. The Turks were able to stand their ground fairly well at the start, but with Austria backing Russia, Hamid's troops began to struggle. Said to have been morally defeated by the ongoing war, Sultan Abdul Hamid died in April of 1789. Salim III took over the Ottoman throne and the continuing war with Russia. Shortly into his reign, Sultan Salim agreed to end yet again the Russo-Turkish War, despite having to accept the ultimate success of the Russians. Once the foreign conflict was settled, Salim set up a committee of reformers and series of reforms relating to taxation, land tenure, and provincial governorships, in addition to continuing the military reforms of his predecessor. Salim also opened Ottoman embassies throughout the European capitals in order to create better relations with the West. To round out the century, the Ottoman Empire was faced with an unexpected plot twist, as Napoleon invaded Egypt. Sultan Salim was forced to declare war on France and, unexpectedly, form an alliance with Great Britain and Russia. This new conflict would continue into the next century, marking yet another era of increasing change for the Ottoman Empire. In the next episodes, we will cover the next chapters of the history of the Ottoman Empire, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell button to be notified when a new video is uploaded. See you next time.